I looked into it, you realize that one of the big reasons is the United Nations is a group that wants a global governance. And to justify that, you need a global crisis. Their head of communications, Melissa Fleming, was bragging that we own the science.
We own the science and we think that the world, should know it.
And she went on to say that they had convinced Google to place any search results about climate change that agrees with the United Nations at the top of the search.
This is Climate Debrief, brought to you by the CO2 Coalition. I'm Angela Wheeler. In a moment, I'll be speaking with CO2 Coalition Director Jim Steele. Jim Steele is a field ecologist with deep roots in biology and environmental teaching. He earned his BS and MA in biology, both from San Francisco State University. From 1984 to 2010, he served as director of SFSU's Sierra Nevada Field Campus, where he taught university-level courses in ornithology and botany. He also taught science in underserved San Francisco schools and developed a medical pathways program focused on biotechnology and human physiology. Later, he lectured in cell and molecular biology at SFSU. His philosophy emphasizes teaching students how to think critically, not what to think, with a strong emphasis on getting out into the field for real-world observation. Jim Steele is the author of Landscapes and Cycles, an environmentalist journey to climate skepticism, sharing his evidence-based perspective on ecology, natural climate cycles, and conservation. Jim, it's so nice to have you on Climate Debrief.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Jim, I'd like to discuss with you what led you to become a climate skeptic and how you learned that the claim there's a climate crisis due to rising CO2 is based completely on zonerisms. What are zonerisms?
Well, I think most people haven't heard the term, but it's something that was honored by some journalists in honor of a 14-year-old Nathan Zoner's science project. And he pushed the hopes of asking students to ban water. Instead of calling it water, he called it dihydrogen monoxide. So right away, a lot of the kids just deferred to him as, oh, he must know more because he used a scientific word. And then what Zoner did is he used all these facts, but only negative facts, to make water look bad. So he said things like, dihydrogen monoxide is corroding our pipes and metal infrastructure. It's rotting our houses. Excess amounts can cause suffocation, meaning drowning. He said now they're even finding it in our reservoirs and in mother's milk. And so all the kids he had 86%, 43 out of 50, signed a petition to ban water. And from that, the word zonerism has come to mean where you can use facts to lead a scientifically ignorant public to false conclusions.
You extensively studied Sierra Nevada wet meadows and bird populations. What compelled you to do that?
Well, I'm just an avid environmentalist, and we wanted to make sure that the ecosystems were functioning as well as possible. And at that time, I was a little concerned that global warming might be an issue. But I was surveying 6 wet meadows in the Sierra Nevada, and we used bird populations. We would catch them and band them and track them as a species indicator for what kind of changes were happening. And one of my most productive meadows all of a sudden started to crash. And what amazed me is I had students and colleagues come in and see this dying vegetation and lack of wildlife and say, that's just what global warming is predicted to do. And they would say that in 5 minutes. No analysis, they didn't look at it. But what I had understood, global warming had nothing to do with it. It was a local event. But in a sense, that's the first zonerism, that global warming dries out, makes evaporation happen more quickly. That dries out the meadows, and therefore climate change was causing my problem. But my other 5 meadows were doing fine. So I knew it was more of a local issue. And then I looked into the record of temperature. You have the United States Historical Climate Network, and the nearest weather station was about 20 miles away in Tahoe City. And you looked at that, the average looked like it was warming. But when you look closer, it was an average is averaging a maximum temperature and a minimum temperature. And the minimum temperature was often under the dew point. So the meadows were wet during minimum temperatures. And my research assistants would wear rain pants. But then you get later in the day and the sun comes out more and it dries it out. It was the maximum temperature that dries the meadow. The idea is if you look at the temperatures at Tahoe City, it showed in the 1930s, the maximum temperatures that would dry out a meadow were worse in the 1930s. It was cooler now. So a couple of those things, I just felt like it's a local problem. And any ecologist that's worth their weight knows that if you're trying to understand a local phenomena, you got to understand the local variables. A global average temperature is obscuring a lot. So as I looked at the data, we see this maximum temperature was greater in the 30s. As I further looked and understood what was going on, it was a railroad track 100 years ago disrupted the stream flow and was now causing the water table to drop so low that it was causing all these problems. So I had a cooperation with the Forest Service and a restoration group. The meadow got restored, and it was spectacular. The vegetation came back, the birds and the wildlife came back. And it led me to feel like if you have a wrong analysis, you're going to have the wrong remedies. If you stop using fossil fuels, that meadow would have continued to degrade and we would have lost everything. So you can't jump on a bandwagon and say, oh, it's global warming.
So was this the turning point when you realized that the drying meadow wasn't caused by CO2 warming?
Absolutely. This was the beginning of me being very skeptical. I said, if I really want to protect these ecosystems, I have to understand everything, which made me start to understand the climate. And the one thing you learn working here in California is El Nino and La Nina is probably the biggest cause of variability. And we would just see that every year. So
you're saying that the CO2 has a warming effect is a zonerism?
Using an average, the zonerism, if you use an average temperature, what we had is what dried out the meadow was the maximum temperature. The minimum temperature was rising, and you average that together, and you use the average, that misleads people to a false conclusion, because they could then say, as CO2 rises, average temperature rises, and that was causing the drying of the meadow. But it was nothing to do with temperature. It had to do with the way the landscape was being degraded. All right, so this idea that the average temperature was obscuring real dynamics that you needed to understand, I looked around at other places. And if you look for the whole United States, you hear all this, the average temperature is rising and it's causing more extreme floods and droughts and wildfires. But if you look at it, 34% of all the long-term weather stations, over 70 years, were cooling trends. And what we notice is two things. If the blue circles are often next to they show cooling, or next to a red cross, it shows warming, and they're right next to each other. So you couldn't have a global effect from CO2, but it's something to do with local effects, what I was seeing in my particular meadow. And even more so is what you would see is concentration of those cooling trends is in the east. And it has to do with the jet stream and La Ninas, which is why the east is freezing right now, because the jet stream brings cold air down to here. And so you have two parts of the country, one getting a little warmer. For a long time, scientists have recognized that the eastern United States has a warming hole. And if you have a warming hole, then you should have milder heat waves. You should have less extremes. But when you average it together, you have this zonerism where now you can say, oh, look, the average temperature is rising, and therefore it's making all these extreme weather climate conditions worse.
In this graph, these satellite images show urban heat islands up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than natural areas. How much of reported warming might come from landscape changes rather than CO2?
I would say 90%. Yeah, I think there's some other natural cycles that cause warming. But when you look at this graph, you have the natural vegetation is green, the gray is the urban areas. And then when they look at it with infrared, you see that it's so much hotter where the gray areas, where they've lost the vegetation. And then these urban heat islands are often where the historical temperature measurements were taken. And you average that together and you say, oh, look, Atlanta's warming. And then that becomes part of this warming temperature that's being pushed to us. But again, this an average temperature is a zonerism because it's leading you to false conclusions. The way to kind of reduce this heat in Atlanta is to reduce some of the urban island heat effects, may bring in more vegetation or whatever, but it has nothing to do with CO2.
How has the way search engines and organizations like the United Nations that prioritize alarmist climate views affected your ability to share your research?
Well, that's what amazed me is I showed people what was causing the problems. The first thing out of their mouths without any thought was, oh, this is just what global warming is going to cause. And as I looked into it, you realize that one of the big reasons is the United Nations is a group that wants a global governance. And to justify that, you need a global crisis. And their head of communications, Melissa Fleming, was bragging that we own the science.
We partnered with Google, for example. If you Google climate change, you will, at the top of your search, you will get all kinds of UN resources. We started this partnership when we were shocked to see that when we Googled climate change, we were getting incredibly distorted information right at the top. So we're becoming much more proactive. We own the science, and we think that the world should know it, and the platforms themselves also do. It's a huge challenge that I think all sectors of society need to be very active in.
In any search results that report skeptical analysis, that gets put 2 or 3 pages later, where people tend not to bother looking. They like the first couple of hits and they're off. To try to counter that, I've made a number of videos showing how natural climate change is happening and how you have to understand that before you can blame CO2.
At wavelengths that are not affected by greenhouse gases. About 14% of the surface heat warms the air above via surface collisions.
It's unsurprisingly, as soon as I post any of those videos, I get a link to the United Nations climate change page. And both Google and YouTube are owned by the same company. So they've kind of kowtowed to whatever the United Nations wants. But other companies are doing the same thing. When my wife and I were out visiting national parks in Utah, and we went to Arches in middle of April, and in the early morning we got some snow on us. So I was sending these pictures of Arches back to friends on Facebook and said, we got snowed on and there's no global warming. And immediately all my personal messages got tagged with a link to the United Nations climate page change. So I feel part of the reason why people are just doing this gullible knee-jerk reaction, any kind of problem they blame on climate change, is because they've just been inundated with this kind of effort from the United Nations.
Jim, you've studied bird populations for 30 years. What initially made you skeptical of claims that climate change is the main driver of widespread bird extinctions or major declines?
First was that my research had no hint that there was a problem with the bird populations. If the landscape was drying out, you lose certain birds that needed more moisture. So you could see it was a local effect. But then to get more funding or to get more clickbait or whatever, people started pushing these extinction events that said climate change is causing everything to go down. And one particular one was that 2.9 billion birds had died since 1970, which just seemed bizarre to me in terms of what I knew. And I've studied extinction events. Most the birds of Hawaii went extinct because you have invasive predators brought in, not because of climate change. Sailors brought in mosquitoes in the 1800s, and they brought in mongoose to kill the rats they brought in. And they all ate birds that were a little tamer in Hawaii or the Galapagos. So, I took a deep dive into looking how they analyzed this and computed these 3 billion birds that were going extinct. It was really about 12 species that accounted for almost 70-80% of this drop. 3 of them were introduced species: house sparrows, starlings, and pigeons, and they accounted for 1/2 billion lost birds. And the reason those birds are going down is because they became a pest. And people hired companies like Bird Be Gone to get rid of these pests so they're not crapping on their tables or their heads or whatever else is going on. So there's 1/2 billion right there that had nothing to do with climate change. But this paper was saying all the effects were being exacerbated by climate change, exacerbated. If you also look at some of the historical changes, some species like fields that are, have a few shrubs, but mostly open so they can get the seeds on the ground. And a lot of these birds that like that kind of habitat were not common in the eastern United States because it was heavily forested. But as colonizers deforested much of the forest to make marginal farms, a lot of these birds' numbers increased dramatically. But then when these marginal farms have started to disappear in these later years as we have more efficient agriculture, the forest grew back and these birds left. So you had this drop of about 250 million birds changed. One of these, the juncos out here in the West, is one of the most abundant birds and there's no change whatsoever in it. So that heightened my skepticism. The biggest change is in grassland birds, and grassland birds have been lost, and there was just 3 species accounted for over almost 400 million lost birds. As agriculture comes in, you lose the grassland and it gets changed to some kind of monoculture. And as agriculture got more efficient, some of the grasslands started to return, but sadly right now they've gone to biofuels, and you see just, as far as the eye can see, sometimes planted with corn, and you still lost more and more grasslands. And so you've lost these species. Again, it has nothing to do with climate change, but it has to do with the landscape change. And then they ignore completely the fact that cats kill 1 to 3 billion birds a year, and that 1 billion birds die every year crashing into windows. So it just felt, instead of looking at all the real problems, they're just saying, and maybe it's just to get published, you have to click everything and say it's connected to climate change.
When people bring up iconic images like suffering polar bears to argue for urgent climate action, how do you typically respond to shift the conversation to the actual population trends?
Well, besides rolling my eyes, I was giving a talk to the San Francisco Economic Roundtable on climate change. And I had a doctor, PhD, when I had question and answers, and he holds up this picture that the National Geographic was pushing. And this picture had 2.5 billion views, and it's of a sickly polar bear. It had nothing to do with climate change. You can't see it has a club foot. It's not a healthy bear. But they use this, and it just pulls on people's heartstrings. And if people don't know any better, they say, oh my God, this is what climate change is doing. Look at this poor bear. But they don't look at everything. So I try to publish a couple of videos in articles talking about the real changes that are going on in the Arctic. So the main thing most people don't understand is the zonerism here is polar bears feed on the ice. And that's a true fact. And therefore, if the ice is melting and we don't have as much ice, then that means that their hunting grounds are being limited and they're going to go extinct the more the ice melts. But there's a whole lot of things that are wrong with that. Number one, when you have ice melt, you allow more photosynthesis. You allow a little more disturbing of the water to help mix the minerals and bring nutrients up to the surface. So that has increased. And we know since 1998, the productivity of the Arctic Ocean is increased by 57%. And that means more fish for more seals, and more seals for more bears. The other thing is when you have less ice, it allows the seals to stay there longer. The reason the bears are hunting on the ice is their favorite prey is the ring seal. And it stays in the Arctic all year. But to do that, they have to make breathing holes. And they can only make the breathing holes in thin ice. If the ice is too thick, it's just too hard to do. And the only time the seals are really on the ice is sometime between March and 1st of July, and that's where they have to give birth to their pups. And also after that, both the pups and the adults have to molt their skin. So you have this small window of when there's plenty of ice for the seals to be on the ice, and that's when the bears are there. So it has nothing to do with the shrinking of the ice later in the summer or during the winter. And if you look at pictures other than what the National Geographic was pushing, you find a lot of these tremendously heavy bears, and they put on most of the weight between March and June because that's where the pups are. They're seeing more triplets because the bears are better fed. They can afford more triplets. And since we stopped hunting polar bears, their numbers have gone from an estimate of 5,000 up to about 36,000. So it clearly has nothing to do with CO2 melting the ice, and there's other reasons that the ice is melting. But less ice right now has been very productive for all the ecosystems in the Arctic.
Thank you for watching. Please tune in next week for the conclusion of our interview with Jim Steele. The Climate Debrief podcast is funded by listeners like you. If you enjoyed listening to this episode of Climate Debrief, please like, comment, and subscribe. We read all of your feedback. If you are interested in finding out more about the CO2 Coalition and its mission, visit our website at co2coalition.org. Our host and executive producer is Angela Wheeler. Production by Ethan Audie and Scott Wheeler. Technical production and editing by Joseph von Spakovsky.